Welcome to another edition of Innovator Insights. I'm Scott Fisher in New York, and this is the show where we pull back the curtain on what it actually takes to build things that last. Our goal here is always to figure out how the best in the world think so we can apply those same playbooks to our own lives and businesses. Today, we're joined by someone who spent years inside the mothership itself. Victor La Bozzetta recently retired as a system engineer at Apple. And when you think of Apple, you think of the polished keynotes and glass cubes, but Victor was in the trenches, specifically in the education sector, making sure the technology actually worked in the real world. He's seen how the global giant navigates the tension between high-level engineering and the messy reality of the human experience. Vic, welcome to the show, man. Glad to have you here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
All right, so let's just get into it. You're officially retired now, so does it feel weird to wake up and not have like 1,000, Apple pings waiting for you? How are you actually spending your time?
It is really strange. I've been an engineer for over 35 years, and 25 of those years at Apple, and it's nice being able to wake up when you want to wake up.
Yeah, but your body, is it getting you up anyway, even though you don't have to get up just from so many years,
I get up at 6 o'clock regardless. If I went to bed at 5 o'clock in the morning, I still get up at 6. I don't know why. It just happens that way.
Well, hopefully over time you can get your body used to the ability to sleep in a little bit.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you were there for a long stretch, right? So taking a look back, what was the culture inside really like as, I don't know, hush hush, as intense as the rumors say, or did you guys actually have some fun there?
Well, we had fun. Okay. They still have fun. It is hush hush. The security is extraordinarily high at Apple. Release of information, especially technical information, is really on a need to know basis. But the fun at Apple is, we would always enjoy, playing the what if game, maybe we could come out with this, maybe we could come out with that. I mean, we did it just as much as everybody in the outside world did, and we had no more insight than anyone else, except for the fact that we lived the culture. So, if anything, we could make a slightly more educated guess. And then when the announcements would come out, we would be, surprised and delight just like anybody else. So
no advance notice.
No advance notice. No, I mean, there are always clues. When you're there as long as I have been there, and there are plenty of people who've been there longer. You look for the poker tells, that sort of thing.
Right.
But the fact that there are so many people at Apple that have been there for well over 15 years, just kind of tells you about the culture.
Sure. All right. So now, when you think about innovation, do you think we overcomplicate it?
Yeah, we overcomplicate everything in technology. Sometimes I think that the thing that we do, we judge our success on how complex the Rube Goldberg machine is going to be. When in fact the reality is the mantra at Apple was always, we need to take things that are really, really complicated and make them easy for everybody to use. So the reality is that in order to make something that's extraordinarily if you think about something like Wi-Fi, okay? If you're a Wi-Fi engineer and you have to go through all of those years of training and all of the pain of taking those exams and studying calculus to the nth degree, no pun intended, then you look at the way Wi-Fi works on a Mac or Wi-Fi works on an iPad or on a phone, and it just works. That ability to make things that simple requires an extraordinary amount of engineering. So when I look at our Wi-Fi engineers, these folks are literally the brightest and the best. They are geniuses. Some of them are just like so far out there geniuses, they're a little scary.
Yeah. Well, we're going to touch upon that in a bit. But after all those years at Apple, how do you describe it to someone who isn't a tech person?
So I'll tell you what I've told just about every one of my schools. Okay.
Mhm.
Apple is a weird company. Okay. Weird in a good way. I've worked, I had a career before Apple. I worked as an engineer for literally several Fortune 10 companies. I guess I can say that, right? Um, and every single one of those Fortune 10 companies was the same. It didn't matter if I went to one or the other or the other. The behavior was identical. It was dog eat dog. It was, you had to get up in the morning and get on that train and you had to get in there early and all of that stuff. And it was exhausting. I came to Apple and it was exactly the opposite. So I'll tell you a real story, true story. Okay. I came to Apple and I came from a 150-year-old British company. Okay. I won't say who. I wore a
Why
full,
not?
what?
Why not?
No, I
Trying to
don't want to
put
get,
you on the
I
spot
don't want to
there.
get sued, So,
It's fine. Go
but,
ahead.
but I went, so I get hired by Apple, right? And they send us to Cupertino for your orientation. And I show up at my orientation wearing a three-piece suit, which is what I wore for 10 years every day riding that train. Okay. And I come in at the front door and the guy goes, dude, are you a visitor? And I'm like, well, no, I'm a new hire. He goes, dude, ditch the tie. It's like, oh, okay. So I go into the training, right? The first thing they tell me is, take the jacket off. Just take the jacket off. Okay. Roll up your sleeves, take the jacket off. If you want to leave the tie on, leave it on, but loosen it. Okay. So I said, all right. Okay. So I'm going through orientation. We have a break and I go out into the quad. This is infinite loop at that point.
The
I go
original
out to the
campus.
quad. Yeah. The original campus. Right. And I go out into the quad and I'm like, everybody here is just like so chill. I mean, is this a California thing? It's like my first time in California. It's like, what do I know about California? Just what you see on TV. And I'm standing there, and all of a sudden, a bunch of guys come running out into the quad using stuff that they made with office supplies to make water balloon guns. Okay. And this is all office supplies. And they are chasing each other and they're laughing and they're having fun and they're doing and I'm standing there and I got my hands like this and I'm horrified. I'm absolutely horrified. And the instructor comes out and he says, what's the matter? I says, they're going to get fired. What if Steve Jobs comes out and sees them doing this? They're going to get fired. And he says, no, they're not. Steve's watching them. I said, what do you mean? He says, look up. And I look up and there's Steve on the patio laughing his ass off. Can I say that?
Yeah. You can say anything you'd like.
Okay. And I'm like, what have I done and where have I gotten myself into? This place is a crazy place, you know? But what you learn pretty quickly is that, that chill attitude is really what makes innovation happen. You know, innovation does not happen when people tell you to innovate. Okay. Innovation happens when you go, wouldn't that be cool? What if we did this? Is that possible? And actually, we never even ask if is it possible? Can we do it? We just say, what do we do? Let's try that. How would we do that? How would we do that? And then we just do.
Amazing. That's really what it's all about. It is that different approach. Like I don't think it's like a lot of things in life. You can't force somebody to do something. Either they have it or they don't, kind of thing. And when you comes to things like innovation, the way you're talking about, I think each person has to have it in them to just have that self drive or that curiosity to make things happen.
Yeah.
Now I remember going way back. I hate to admit how long, but when I was a kid, right, every classroom had an Apple IIe because they basically gave them away. And at some point that just stopped, right? So from your side of things, why did Apple move away from that get them while they're young strategy?
So I don't think that Apple ever moved away from that strategy. Okay. Steve wanted to give every student a Mac and an Apple IIe. He wanted to give everyone that. The reality is that they weren't allowed to, because a school is a public entity, and then there's all kinds of antitrust things that happen when you do that.
Mhm.
So, Apple had to be very, very careful, and they had to say, "Hey, we want to do this, we just can't do it." And so, Steve pulled back and said, "Yeah, we're not going to do that anymore. But we are always going to support education." The interesting thing is that, I I believe that Apple's philosophy is that the education division was a cost of doing business. Okay, it wasn't there to really, really make money. Although it's a corporation, the trustees want to see money made. Board of directors, but it was never Steve's vision that education division would make money. It was always his vision that we would always be there for the youngest student. And his reason, and he said this many times to us, when he talked to us, the engineers, it was always different experience than when he talked to the general public. When he talked to us, he was really just Steve. Okay. And he believed that every child should have the opportunity to find their own inner genius. He felt every student was a genius, every single one of them. And the problem is our job as educators, or educators in general,
Mhm.
is to find that. You have to find that because they're too young to find it themselves. You have to guide them to find it. And that's what he always wanted the education vision to be. That was his goal.
Right, and that's admirable, but there's two other aspects to that whole concept of putting the computers in the schools and the donations.
Yeah.
As I mentioned in my comment, many people felt like it was breeding. Let's get them hooked
Yeah.
on Macs now, so they'll use them for the rest of their life. Right? That's part
Yeah.
A. But part B is the reality is Apple is a corporation. Steve Jobs was a businessman,
Yep.
and he did in fact lobby to get millions of dollars in tax credits for those donations back. So it actually ended up costing Apple literally, 1% of what they were donating, in cost. So I agree with his actual, I believe you and him when he said his goals were admirable and that he really wanted to help the children. I'm not
Mhm.
denying that part. But I think he was also a very bright man and said, I can do both. I can help the children and save the company some money or do it in a cost effective way, right? And I guess that's part of being in charge of a company, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's funny that you say that because yes, you're 100% correct. First and foremost, Apple is a corporation.
Mhm.
Okay, and if you're a corporation and you're in a capitalist society, your job is to make money. Okay, that's just what a capitalist is. Okay,
Right.
so he was a capitalist, but he was a capitalist with he did have integrity and he did have morals. Um, the interesting thing is that he always used to say, and it wasn't just him, it was kind of a mantra in the company, always go for the win-win. You know, we don't like the win-lose. We like the win-win. We really don't like the win-lose when we're on the lose. But, you
Yeah.
know, always go for the win-win. So, yes, you do have to get these devices into school. Yes, you do have to get them into the hands. But on the other hand, we still have to be able to make money so we can put devices into the hands,
Of course.
you know? Now, the 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 interesting thing about the education division, and it's the only education division in the world that I am aware of that invests money not just in sales, but in having like learning executives and having curriculum and having an entire marketing division dedicated only to building curriculum, like everyone can code and everyone
Mhm.
create that kind of stuff. So so yes, you do have to make money, and it is a brilliant strategy to get them young. It is true. There is truth in that statement. But on the other hand, you can still be a capitalist and have morals. And I
Right.
think that that's the thing that Steve really wanted to project.
Yeah, I agree. And my former life is a tech director, in schools for many, many years. And yeah, Apple was always great with all those things that you mentioned and the programs and the curriculum and things like that. In the later years of my career, there were others that have started doing that too. I don't know whether it's copycat syndrome or more or less paying homage to Apple, like you guys did such a great job. We're going to follow the model kind of thing. But I saw others like HP and even today, HP especially, I see they have a very big presence and a very big instructional component. And they really work with the classrooms worldwide, as well.
Mhm.
But Apple definitely did a great job of doing that as well. Now, I've always been a huge fan of Macs. I mean, for me,
Mhm.
the they just work mantra, it's always been true. I mean, I have an iPhone. I've worked on Macs for years. In fact, I'm using a Mac laptop, right now for this episode. But I also have a Chromebook sitting next to me, and
Mhm.
that can handle most of the tasks that today's users require since the huge shift to the cloud and web-based apps and things like
Yep.
that. So, I'm not saying that Chromebooks match up to MacBooks, but it honestly feels like at some point maybe Apple just sort of let Google slide in, and take over the classroom? Did it feel like that internally? Like, did you guys see the
Yeah.
Chromebook coming and just decide it wasn't a fight worth having, or how did that play out?
Yeah, that's a long and complicated story, and I'm happy to discuss it with you. I don't know how much time you have.
We have
Okay,
all the time that you can. Oh, that's right. You're retired. Go for it.
I don't
We'll make this into a series, okay?
listen. Just don't impede on my nap time. That's all. Okay.
No problem. Go ahead. Seriously, take
So
as long as you'd like.
so first and foremost, I have to applaud Google. Okay, because I think they did a spectacular job. Okay, they really really did. They stepped into, nature abhors a vacuum, and there was this huge vacuum that happened in the educational world. Okay, and Google stepped in and they stepped up to the plate and they did a good job. They really really did. Okay, no question about that. Steve didn't believe that our job was to become the biggest company in the world. He felt that our job was to create the best products in the world. Okay. Um, what the world, however, believes, and the way the world works is the best product doesn't always win. Okay. And because Google created something that was cheaper, faster, and simpler to use, that's the way the world shifted. Apple didn't believe that cheap and easy was the way to go. Apple believed that just make the best product. And Apple still does make the best product. They still make phenomenal products, but teachers needed something simple. They needed something fast. And the IT department, which was already stretched beyond their limits,
Right.
and especially funding wise, needed something cheap and easy. Okay. And Google stepped up to the plate and said, here's a Chromebook. This will do the job. Okay. Now, the philosophy between the two devices goes far beyond just, this is cheaper and this is more expensive, or this is a better device or whatever. You know, the philosophy is driven not by the device, but by the ecosystem. Okay. And in my humble opinion, I think that that's where the gears didn't sync up. Okay.
Yeah.
We had an ecosystem, but it was an ecosystem that was geared towards consumer
Right. And not
and not
education.
education, you know?
Yeah. I mean, because honestly, from a management perspective, the Chrome devices, as you know, it's much easier for an administrator to manage. You mentioned cost, but it's also easier in terms of management because you literally hand the child another device if they broke it or they lost it, and as soon as
Yeah.
they log in, they have everything at their disposal. And I know Mac can do the same thing, but there's third-party MDM tools and all that kind of stuff that's involved, but it was just not as clean. So you're right. The Apple product is a quality product, and there are schools out there that we both know that they don't care about. I shouldn't say it. They don't. It's not that they don't care about the cost. They see the value in investing in the better product in Apple. Okay, because they know it's a better product. However, as you're pointing out, many of the schools don't have that luxury. So for them, the ability to get a low cost device and have it managed, and like you said, the ecosystem behind it, because the whole Google Apps and Drive and all that kind of stuff just took over. So I agree with you. I think there was a bit of a disconnect there with Apple, and I think it was a missed opportunity. And I hate to say, I don't think it's as drastic, but it was sort of like the way Microsoft missed the whole internet. It's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
how did you miss that? I mean, looking back, you go, how could you
How
possibly
could you
not
possibly
recognize it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Hindsight being 2020. But yeah, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think even hindsight being 2020, Apple, I don't think would have done anything different, you know?
Okay.
Um, but here's, again, from an engineering point of view. So to point out exactly what you're saying, the fundamental difference between the two devices is one device works in the cloud and one device works on the device.
Right.
Okay. Data lives on the device, data lives in the cloud. Okay. That fundamental difference is what drove Chrome.
Mhm.
Because that ecosystem living in the cloud meant it was very, very easy to make changes. They could do whatever they want up in the cloud. Okay.
But you needed an internet connection.
But you needed an internet connection, right? And that's why all of a sudden you started the birth or the incredible growth and the amount of money invested in schools away from devices to infrastructure.
Wi-Fi and so forth, right?
Right. So if you were 10 years ago, if you had the foresight to go ahead and become a network engineer or a Wi-Fi engineer, which is how I started, okay, then you were just sitting pretty through the last 10 years because you were in the right place at the right time.
For sure. Now, you just said, I'm just thinking back to what you said a moment ago. I just want to back up for a moment. You said that if Apple did it all over again, so to speak, you don't think they would change their philosophy, right? Is
Right.
that true even with Tim now in charge rather than Steve? Or do you think he would have in other words, tell me a little bit about the different ways they operate
Differences?
or
Oh, yeah.
the way they think.
Yeah. What the differences between them? Well, um, Steve, Steve always, he said to us, again, he talked to us a little bit different than he talked to everybody else. Okay. And he said, I don't care if Apple is the biggest company in the world. I don't care how much profit we make. I don't care about that. What I care about is this product. Okay. Um, and, and he was vicious when it came to this product. Okay. So like when he came back after he was ousted and he came back, the first thing that he did was he drew a Punnett square and he said, we're going to make 4 devices. That's it. Every other thing that you're working on, kill it. You know how hard that is to do,
I
especially when
can
you're a
imagine.
multi-million-dollar company? So he was vicious when it came to the product, okay? And he was passionate about the product. Tim is passionate about the business, okay? Tim was always a production guy. He was always the guy that made all the gears spin, okay? So he's the production guy. He's the guy that took Apple from being where it was to being a $3 trillion company. And that's his genius. His genius was knowing where to invest the money and what companies to buy and how to do this and how to do that to make us a $3 trillion company. That's not where Steve wanted to go.
Do you think that some of the creativity was lost, or do you think that that Tim and the people that followed Steve, and I've loved, by the way, I'm sorry, I'm saying Steve and Tim like I know these guys personally. I've no personal connection to Steve Jobs or Tim Cook.
Yeah.
You may have, so but we'll just keep it simple. But do you think that Tim built upon what Steve was doing and was able to keep enough of that creative juices flowing type mentality, but make it a better business? Or do you think something was lost in becoming this financial, behemoth that it is?
So it's a hard question, okay? And again, this is completely my opinion. All right. I think that the Steve years, okay, Steve had the ability to look at something and say something mundane and say, that's a good technology. We're going to incorporate that in. Okay. There were so many little things that were incorporated into the devices during his time that people don't even realize that they're just kind of in the background. speech to text. Big deal. Today, it's like, okay, everything's got speech to text. But in those days, you had to buy a product like Dragon to make it work, So those were the kind of things that Steve did. He took things that you would think are mundane and he would say, no, this is really important, okay? And he could recognize that. Tim, on the other hand, can recognize this is a business that we're spending money on. We need to buy that business, okay? So that way we don't have to spend money on that certain thing,
We can
okay?
do it bigger, better, faster
We can do
ourselves.
a bigger, better fit for ourselves, right? They don't give Tim enough credit for the migration to the M processor, okay? That was Tim. That was his baby. Tim was the one who said, we need to completely reinvent the processor. Now, did he invent it? No. But did he send the engineers out and he say, here's your task, go out and do this, find this? Because he recognized the value and the importance of that processor, okay? And building it in-house, making our own processor. So did Apple lose the innovation? What Apple doesn't have with Tim is Steve's ability to see genius in mundane, okay? What Tim has the ability to do is to see where we need to be and what do we need to do to get there, okay? Very different philosophies.
So let me play a little bit of devil's advocate here, okay?
Right.
Do you think Steve is as much of an innovator as the image he has, or do you think he was just a very good marketer?
Oh, you know what? I got that question more often than you think. Okay.
Wow, I thought it was original. Darn it.
No, you have to understand something. That's a great question. It's the right question to be asking. Okay. So Steve was a marketeer. No question about that. He was a marketeer. Okay. But seeing Steve work, you could see that he was much more than that. Okay. So he really was the whole package. He was exactly what you would think. Okay. Was he a pain in the ass? Yes. Okay. But he used to say, the only reason why I'm a pain in the ass is because you're not doing the best that you can do.
Right.
And he was typically right. I mean, look, Steve screwed up too. He made mistakes too, so.
Yeah, but somehow he landed on his feet and, he did very well for himself financially as well. So, but as you said, Tim has taken the company in many different directions. From a strictly innovation point of view, do you see either the intensity of innovation or the quantity of innovative ideas and productions, has it diminished since Tim has come on board?
Yeah. So yes. Okay. There has been a dimming of the way innovation is done. And I think that the challenge is because unlike Steve, Apple is innovating in a lot of different ways, in different things. Whereas Steve would have been like, oh, AirPods, this is what we're going to focus all our attention on. Okay. Or whatever. Vision Pro, we're going to only focus our attention on that, at the sacrifice of everything else. That was the not good part of what Steve would do. Okay. Tim, on the other hand, is innovate, and, like here. So he's spreading it out like a blanket. And because of that, you don't innovate as fast. You don't have the resources to do what you would have done before because it's not, you're not a laser focused like that. So yeah, innovation has slowed down at Apple. There's no question about that. I mean, it's obvious. You can see that. But it doesn't mean that innovation has stopped. It just means innovation is being focused on a lot of different areas.
Right. And my experience has been that, the more areas you try to be good at, the less likely you're able to. In other words, you can focus on fewer things and do a better job than you can on many things. So you take the Vision Pro, for example, right?
Yeah.
Would that have ever happened with Steve Jobs? Would something like that have even come about? Like, it just seems like perhaps there was so much money available at Apple these days that they
Yeah.
went down this road of something that it was basically a product that I don't know if anybody was asking for it, was it?
Yeah, I mean, Vision Pro is an interesting device, okay? The device itself is pretty amazing, all
Mhm.
right? And that's on the plus side. In my opinion, on the minus side is it's too expensive, it's too bulky, and it's too complicated to create apps for, okay? Now that's my opinion on that, okay?
Right.
When you look at competitor devices, they are significantly less expensive, and they do, in many cases, a good enough job to do what you want to do. Now, that being said, the whole concept of a visual OS like that, I think it's a pretty darn obvious next generation of where things are going. That's where things are going. You have to think the big advent in technology today is going to be three things, in my opinion. Okay, visual OS. Okay, AI, and then the stepchild that nobody likes to talk about, quantum computing. Okay. Those three things are going to change the world completely. They already are. They're already starting to change the world. But not enough people pay attention to the fact that a visual OS is the direction things have to go.
Yeah, but, you know, think about this. Well, help me understand.
You know,
You've taken a leap to visual now, right? But we're
yeah,
still at a point where the Macs are not touchscreens. Why
correct.
why why is that? Yeah, was that strictly a business decision? Like, we're giving them an iPad, so if we gave them a touch screen laptop, we would not need the iPad product line, right? Or what
Yeah.
how did we in other words, how did Apple go from jumping right over the touchscreen computer and going to the visual
Visual OS.
operating?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I can tell you the reason why Macs don't have a touch screen.
sure.
Okay. That's actually not a business decision. That was an engineering decision,
Okay.
interestingly enough. Okay. Um, what Apple did extensive research. Apple does extensive research on everything. You have no idea how much research Apple does. It's frightening. Okay. It's almost, analysis paralysis, to be honest with you. But um, what engineering found was that the process of doing this to this to this to this to this to this was inefficient, number one. And number two, it's concerning because it can cause literally repetitive motion injuries. Okay. So it was engineering that decided, that putting a touchscreen is probably not wise to do on a laptop. Now, putting a touchscreen on an iPad, on the other hand, because its physical interface is completely different, is the right way to do it. So it wasn't a business decision.
Hmm.
Interesting, right?
I guess I just questioned the decision because, as you know, many of the Chromebooks and even non-Chromebooks,
Yeah.
Windows devices are all touchscreen at this point.
Yeah.
And because the kids who are born into this world, I mean, all the kids today, even kids that have graduated already from through tradition, through normal high school senior level or whatever, they
Yeah.
grew up with a touch device from the day they were born.
Yeah.
So for Apple to still be at a point where they're going, yeah, we know, but is kind of
Yeah.
it's surprising. But now talking about the new technology, especially going back to the schools. Let's talk about the Neo, okay?
Yep.
Basically a $599 MacBook, right? Is
Yeah.
that sort of like Apple admitting maybe they kind of messed up a little bit and they're trying to get their way back into schools the way we talked about, Chromebooks and things like that?
Yeah. So I was uh, I was on the line with some of my friends when the Neo was introduced, and the resounding answer was, "It's about freaking time."
There you go.
We have been asking for this for a very long time. Yeah, I mean, I can guess why it took Apple so long to create a $500 laptop, but I think part of it has to do with the processor. The processor that's in there is different. It's a less expensive processor. It's so it, it-
Well,
okay.
but the key to it though, not the key,
Yeah.
but one of the selling points to it is that it's so repairable,
Yep.
compared to other models. I mean,
Yep.
iFixit broke it down, and everybody's talking about the fact that the schools, like they can now with the devices they're using, they can swap out the screens. They can do stuff on their own and
Right.
save the time of sending it out or paying somebody. And in a lot of schools, their innovation, if you will, is let's use the student labor that we have. We'll make it a club, or we'll make it something fun for them, or more honestly, giving them a chance to have real world experience. We'll let
Yeah.
them work on the devices. Now they can do that again with
Yeah.
these Macs.
It's so funny. I have to laugh about this, okay? Because you have to, I built my first computer when I was 13, okay? And I guess they can't catch me now. So, uh, I actually did volunteer work because I was too young to actually work at a Radio Shack, just so I could pick up the spare components I needed to actually build the computer, you know? So, so yeah, I built all my own stuff. I built an O-scope. I built all kinds of things like that. So I came from a world where engineers built things. We had a vision and we would build something, and oh yeah, software had to be added. Okay, that sort of thing. Oh, you need to learn, assemblers to be able to do this, then do that. Okay. Um, then we went to the world of, all these devices are, not serviceable. So focus on the software. Focus on the software. Anything that has to be repaired, throw it away. Throw away society. And now we're going back to, gee, you should be able to actually work on your own device. It's like, now you go back to that. It's like, okay.
Well, so now if you were in the lab there, right, helping to design the Neo, right?
Yeah.
What's the innovation that actually matters? Is it price point, or is there something else that a student actually needs?
It can't break in the hands of the student. Okay. That's number one. Okay. Number two, if you got to change a keyboard, it should be easy enough for a teacher to do. Okay. Because they like to, what they like to do? They like to change the letters on the keyboard to be something funny.
Really?
Yeah. You've never seen that one before.
No, never.
Right? You should be able to do that. And the other thing is, it should be inexpensive, of course, so that way a school can afford it in the
Right.
first place, so that they don't have to actually, like lease a kidney to be able to buy the products for students. You know,
Sure.
but really, in my opinion, the focus of any kind of technology for a school should not be around the IT department. It should be around the teacher. Teachers should be able to do their job without the technology getting in the way. Okay.
Absolutely.
And that's why I would design a device like a Neo to be like that. Okay.
Interesting. All right. So now what's one thing about the way Apple builds products that most people would be surprised to know? Like just anything, like, oh my, kind of showing us something behind the scenes there.
So every company in the world that I have ever worked for, and I've worked for manufacturers and I've worked for finance companies and everything like that, they do things based upon focus groups.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The only other company besides Apple that does not work on focus groups is Ford. Now, believe it or not. And it is not our invention. It is not Apple's invention. I keep saying our. I have to stop that because I'm retired. Okay. It is not Apple's invention to do that. It was actually Henry Ford's invention, because he said, and it's a very famous quote, I'm sure you know it. If I asked people what they wanted in a horse and carriage, they'd say faster horses, not an automobile. Okay. So that philosophy is a very different way that Apple works. We don't work on focus groups. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't listen to what feedback is. Feedback@apple.com. I've met the people who are on that team, and yes, they do take it very, very seriously. Okay. But Steve and Apple and Tim, they listen to the population, but they really, how do I phrase this? You can either build what people want, or you can build what people need but don't know they need it.
Right.
Does that make sense?
No, it makes absolute sense. I mean, I've heard, that attributed to Steve, they don't know what they want. We have to tell them what they want
Yep.
kind of
Yeah.
philosophy. Um, but now at Apple, is innovation like, is it still, you think, or was it ever always about like these big world changing ideas, or is it like more little stuff like small fixes that most people don't even know are taking place?
Yeah. So the big world changing things were not by design.
Okay.
It's always been incremental, always been incremental. Look, here's the reality. The reality is Apple the most innovative company in the world? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Okay. Apple doesn't invest money in a lab that says, gee, what if I take zinc and I mix it with this? Will I get this compound? Apple's not that company. Okay. Companies like NVIDIA are those companies. Okay. And even Google Labs. So that's not what Apple was. But what Apple is this is an existing technology and it sucks. How do I make it better? Now, I'll give you a real true story, okay?
Uh-huh.
When back in 1990, I'm going to screw up the date, 7 or 98, IBM introduced USB. And the engineering world called it the useless serial bus. Now, of course, it's the universal serial bus, but
Of course.
it was the useless serial bus. And it was literally discarded by IBM. They invented it. They put millions of dollars and hours into it, and nothing happened with it, right? Steve came along and said, I got a better idea. I can trim all of this stuff out of all of those ports, throw them away, replace them with just this USB port. I don't need anything else. And he puts it on the iMac. And everybody in the world said, are you insane? Useless serial bus? How is that going to be innovative? And he said, no, we're going to make USB work. And that's what we did. We improved the USB. The protocol existed, but we improved the technology. So that way, you could daisy chain a keyboard and you could daisy chain this and you could add this and you can do that and you can do that. Now show me a device that doesn't have USB on it.
Right.
Okay. That is the innovation that Apple does. We don't invent new things. We take things that have already been invented and we make them work.
Which is both great because it makes your life easier, less things you have to pack, in your bag when you're traveling, so to speak, as far as adapters and things like that. Unless you are somewhere where you still you have that one device that's still old school, that you have to plug in, whether it be a printer or whether it be something, then it can be a little bit frustrating. Or the USB A versus C type thing, that's still a little challenging. But it's gotten much better for sure, no doubt about that. Now,
and hence the dongle industry was invented.
Yeah. No doubt. So you've worked with a lot of smart people, I guess, right? So you mentioned earlier, I said I wanted to get back to this. What's the difference between a smart engineer and someone who actually knows how to innovate?
Wow. Now that one, I never got that question. So you get points on that.
All right. I'll take them.
And that's really a good question. So, all right. And I can say anything I want, right?
Anything you want.
Okay. All right.
About anyone.
About anyone. Okay. So, in my humble opinion, in my experience, working in the engineering world, especially computer engineering, I think pretty much all of us are on the spectrum.
I agree, and I'm putting myself in there. So go ahead.
Okay. So interpersonal skills are not something that we have naturally. We have to develop those skills. Okay. A good engineer could invent the next great widget in the world, right? But if they don't have the skill to be able to explain how that technology works to everyone else, that just makes them a good engineer.
Right.
A great engineer has the ability to create new stuff and say, this is why you need this, because it does this, and be able to communicate that concept to somebody in plain language. Okay. So that is really the differentiator, because all engineers are fairly brilliant. Every single one of them that I've ever met, you know?
Mm-hmm.
There was an engineer that I worked with. His name was, I guess I can say it, right? John Tucker, right?
Okay.
And he was a pretty amazing guy. He was way up there at Apple. And this is when I first started. And John this is why he was such a genius of an engineer. He invented a lot of stuff. Stuff that no one will ever know, you know, because it's all under the hood. But the first time that I met him, there were 3 people talking to him. And he was having a conversation with this guy, eye level, you know, just having this conversation. And I'm new and I'm a fly on the wall. Okay. And he's having this conversation, and he's like, his conversation is, you know, a little above my head, but I could follow it. Right. And then there was another person over here that asked him a question, and he turned to that person and he started talking to them. It was very nice and everything. But all of a sudden, his level dropped to about here, and it was below where I was, right? And I'm like, but it was seamless.
He knew his audience.
Right. And he had this conversation. He had no problem explaining it, you know, no. Then he turned to this other engineer comes up to him and says, John, we got to talk about this. Then all of a sudden his conversation went boom through the stratosphere. And he was like talking about things in calculus and physics that I was like, does that even exist?
Right.
You know? And that's when I realized this guy's from another planet or something like that, because I've never seen anybody do that.
That's a very special set of skills that person had to be able to do that and seamlessly, and not make the other people feel like he was talking down to them in any way, you know,
right,
speaking at their level. That's a talent that, All right, let me touch upon quickly something else here that just popped into my head. Innovation versus creativity. And I want to talk just real briefly about Johnny Ive. Now, Johnny, was he an engineer, or how would you title it? What would your classification of him be? And just quickly, how has Apple changed now that he's not there in terms of innovation, because the innovation was so tied to the creativity that came out of him and the work he was doing?
So Johnny, the way I describe Johnny is he was an artistic engineer. Okay. He had a vision of how things should look and feel and behave and act. You know, iOS operating system and everything like that is you know, brainchild sort of thing. The way things are physically designed were his brainchild. You know, the reason why your trackpad doesn't have any buttons on it, things like that. Okay. So he was a minimalist. He said, the simpler the better, the simpler the better, the simpler the better. And, you know, one of the reasons, you know, when he left, we kind of stepped back and said, well, you know, we don't want to just radically change things, because that's not who Apple is, unless there's a reason to radically change things. But maybe we don't need to be so minimalistic. So in other words, we don't need to make things razor thin that are completely non-serviceable. Okay. We don't need to do that. And we can listen to what people want and give them something more what they're asking for. So Johnny would never have created a Neo. He would have never done it. Simply, you know, it wasn't his style. Not that he's wrong. It's just not his style.
Just different.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. We've gone on for quite a while, and I could sit here and talk to you all day. So let me just wrap up a couple of quick questions here. These are more my curiosity type questions. So now that, you know, you're not working with Apple anymore, everything's still blue bubbles for you, or any non-Apple stuff that has sort of crept into your life, or that you feel more comfortable using or taking out in public now that you're not, you know, wearing Apple on your stuff?
Yeah. Sure. I mean, and not that I'm doing brand endorsements, but this is one of my favorite new devices right here. This is an Aura Ring.
Oh, nice.
Right? And fills in the gap of what my watch does not do. Okay, first of all, it's got a 7-day battery, which is phenomenal.
Yeah.
I mean, look at this thing. 7-day battery, really? Okay, come on. Why does this only have a 2-day battery?
Listen, yesterday, no joke, and I'm not bringing it up because this just happened to be sitting here. This is what I bought yesterday. I don't know if you could see it.
Oh,
Okay?
yeah.
This is a $90 smartwatch. And guess what? For me, it does everything the Apple Watch does, or
Yeah.
all the pieces of the Apple Watch that I need. I don't need
Yeah.
everything else. So for me, that's the way to go,
Yeah.
So I get it. At least you could be a little bit more open now and not feel like you're going to be taken
Yeah.
out back and spoken to, so to speak. But
Yeah.
again, now that your life has changed, you moved away from the day-to-day grind and so forth, low tech stuff. Anything that helps keep your head straight that's not high tech?
You're going to laugh.
Okay.
You're going to laugh. Okay. I have been spending an inordinate amount of time baking.
Good for you.
Okay. I have now mastered sourdough, and I am moving on to Irish soda bread later on today.
Very cool.
But there's this cool app that I use called Resimi. I don't know if you've heard of it. Right?
Yeah.
So, you go through Instagram, you go through Facebook, you go through TikTok. Well, that's the other thing. I can actually have TikTok on my device now.
But do you want it?
Well, I'm just saying, but I can do it now. Not that I want it, but I can do it. So, you go through these things and you say, what is the best recipe for, I don't know, beef stew, right? And it comes up with a million recipes and you start scrolling through them and you go, that's the one I want, right? So what do you do now? You click the little save button, you create a list and everything like that, and you never find it again. So this app, Resimi, says, okay, send it to Resimi. And Resimi reads it, uses AI, creates the actual recipe and a cookbook, and it stores it and it's indexable. So you can say, you open up Resimi and say, where's that recipe for Irish soda bread? There it is. That's the one I want. Boom. Okay. It's really cool.
Now, you just touched upon 3 things, and that's a great way to finish this up, okay?
Yeah.
You talked about the need to do some things offline, okay? And everything can't be strictly tech.
Right.
But you've also pointed out the value of AI, where things are heading, and how you can use AI in a limited amount of tech to get to that offline tool or task or hobby that you're trying to do. And I think that's the value. I think if we can maximize that, if we can keep that circle flowing, spinning, I think that's where there's some real value here, where we can benefit all of us from the technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. AI is a whole other topic. We could spend hours talking about it, but that will require some libation. So,
all right. Sounds good. Listen, Victor, man, thanks for the time. This is really eye-opening. It's not every day we get to hear how the machine, actually works from someone who is in there kind of turning the gears and stuff. So for everyone listening, if you've got something out of this, if Vic gave you a new way to look at your own business or your own systems, do me a quick favor. You know the drill. Hit the like button, give us 5 stars on whatever platform you're on, and definitely hit the subscribe button and ring that bell so you don't miss the next one. Sounds like small stuff, but it's what keeps this show running and helps us get more guests like Victor in here. Check out the show notes at innovatorinsights.io for links to everything we talked about today. I'm Scott Fisher in New York. Keep innovating, and we'll see you on the next episode.